Hello and welcome to Ask an Author with Julia Kelly. I am really thrilled to be joined by a good friend who has written a really fantastic book that we're going to get to dive into and talk about all the juicy details today. Renee Ryan, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. I'm really honored and I'm so excited to talk to you.
Well, I'm really thrilled as well because I just finished the audiobook actually of The Widows of Champagne, which was fantastic. And we can talk about sort of the experience of audiobooks versus print in a moment here. But I think this is a book that's really going to resonate with a lot of readers. And I know there are some people who are already talking about having read it in the group. But for those of us who haven't read it yet, can you tell us a little bit about The Widows of Champagne?
Sure, it's a story. It's a multi-generational story. It's a story about the matriarch of this long-standing family who has been in the champagne business for 200 years, and she's the matriarch. And then her granddaughter is also pretty much the main character, and she is taking over as the grandmother is starting to pull back. And then the in between heroine is the granddaughter's mother, and she's the daughter-in-law of the matriarch. And it's these women who are, as so many of these champagne houses, are all widowed through tragedy, through war, the previous World War I, and are faced with running the champagne house on their own, as many of the champagne houses did have this happen. Veuve Clicquot is only one of the many. Bollinger, many of them had their widows that were running, the widows of the original vintners, or champenois, running these vineyards. And so it's a story about these women who are kind of clicking along, and then another war hits. And it's the story of how they deal with continuing to run the vineyard, the champagne house during Nazi occupation, during World War II, the trials and tribulations, and also thinking about the future. How are they going to secure a future beyond war with this? And so I just really delved into what it was like to have an occupying force in your home.
Yeah, it's an absolutely fascinating subject, and one especially in the Champagne region that I think is really unique because of how valuable the product champagne actually was to the Nazis, and they intentionally went there really trying to steal the treasures of France, right?
Right. They the Nazis, whenever they would basically occupy a country, take over a country, conquer a country, whatever word you want to use for it, they stole the treasures of that country because they decided, Hitler was very much of an appropriator, and that became Germany and German ownership. And France's one of their number one treasures was their champagne. And I think, as I've said before, is that I didn't say it here, but I've said before is that. Um, the champagne making process is a very complicated process, and it's a very difficult process. And I've had many people ask me, well, couldn't they just recreate the champagne once it was stolen? Because that's what they did. They stole
Mhm.
it. And it's like, no, you can't recreate a 1919 champagne. You can't recreate an 1867 champagne. You can make new champagne, but you can't create these wonderful champagnes that were very valuable. And the Nazis, they would, when they would conquer a land, or they would try and rally their troops, they gave them champagne as a reward. So there was a lot of champagne that needed to be produced for the German war machine.
Yeah, it's really an incredible story, not only for that perspective, but also you touched a little bit on it. It's really a story about what it's like having an occupying force in your home, very up close and personal. And I've seen stories about occupation, and I've seen stories about people dealing with that before. What I thought was really interesting about this book was you see it from the perspectives of three different women, four if you want to include a non-POV character, Paulette. But you see it across different generations, and how they all approach that and how they interact with that person is really, really interesting. So I don't know if you want to tell us a little bit about these women, and then maybe a little bit about sort of when they're presented with the fact that they're going to have a German officer living in their home, what their reaction and their approach is.
Okay, well, we'll start with Josephine, the matriarch. She's in her late 70s, and she's starting to really suffer early signs of dementia. And and she feels that something's wrong inside her head. She knows something's happening, but she also knows that war is looming when you've opened in the opening of the book, and she has to prepare her family for, because she's survived several wars, and she knows the loss. She lost her son in the previous war, and she knows that loss. And so her whole motivation, and especially when von Schmidt moves into their home, is to protect the future and to do it before she loses her mind and, you know, in her memory. And so her she has a diary she keeps, and that becomes her memory, is this diary, but she has to keep it hidden from him. And she also uses her dementia as a weapon. And she becomes sort of the feeble old woman in his mind, and she uses that as a weapon. But there are moments when it becomes very real for her, and it's very true that she's forgotten something. And so it's a very dangerous route to take while you have an enemy in your home. But she's also a very courageous woman for that reason.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the youngest daughter, Gabrielle, who she has the most POV scenes. She's really your true heroine,
Yeah.
because she's the future of the Champagne House, and she is younger. She's in her late 20s. And she's lost her husband. It was an accident. And he died of gangrene, actually. And she wasn't supposed to be running the Champagne House by herself. She's suffered too many losses. She lost her father.
I'm so sorry, my doorbell just rang. This is living in London, unfortunately. So we'll keep going.
She lost her father through the First War, who came home very tortured with the mustard gas and the what we would call PTSD. She's lost her husband. She's losing her grandmother. The other two women don't want anything to do with the vineyard, and she's just feeling super burdened with all of that. And when this man moves into her home, she begins to fight back by keeping an eye on him. She does join the resistance, but not in the way that most people would think she joins the resistance. It's more shuttling information to other people that she thinks maybe is important, doesn't know. But really, I mean, she's really struggling just to maintain control in a time when nobody had control.
Yeah.
And then you have the middle heroine, Helene, who I think is your most complicated. And I've had readers tell me she was very cold at first and became their favorite character. She's a former Parisian. She married into this wealthy Champagne family, into what she thought was going to be this glamorous life in a vineyard in a Champagne house. And she was going to become the face of the Champagne house and sell the product and be the marketing person, sort of. And then she loses then World War I hits, she loses her husband. When he comes home, she has a baby to try and save their marriage. She's feeling very much fish out of water. And when this gentleman that moves in, the Nazi that moves into their home, he sets his sights on her and really sets his sights on the younger daughters. And so it becomes the catalyst for her to become his personal secretary, and then more, so that she can protect the family. And each one of these women use their weapons that they have and their tools as women to protect the others.
Yeah, it's really a story of sort of familial strength, but shown through really different, really interesting ways. And I think there's a lot of moral gray area in this book, which I think is fascinating, because it's so easy sometimes to sit there and say, well, this person's good and this person's bad, especially in a story set during World War II, because it does seem so clear in hindsight. But I think that there are people who are caught in the middle of things, who make decisions and then have to live with the consequences of those decisions, whether there's decisions that we judge as good or bad. And I think, Helene, I'm not surprised that people are so drawn to her, because she really is a character who is in the middle of a very deep moral quandary. And I could see some people saying, you know, what she did wasn't right. You know, and I could see some people also saying, no, actually she had her reasons, and you know, and this is why. So that contradiction is really interesting. And it must have been fascinating as a writer, kind of playing around with that in a character.
Yeah, you know, as a storyteller, I love what you just said, because it was that was sort of my goal when I wrote this book, was that there was very gray areas, like you said, and I wanted to explore. And I think with Helene, it was the most tangible exploration with her, because of the choice that she makes, and you know, to become the mistress of this man living in her home. And I've had readers who are like, well, or not readers, I would say even, yeah, maybe readers that would say, I wonder why, you made that decision, because that's the reality of what it was like
Yeah.
to live during this time. And and I really didn't want to pull any punches. And I thought, I'm going to write this story the way that I feel it needs to be written, then I need to go all the way with that. And as a storyteller, I just felt like that would have shortchanged the reader and the story and even the characters if I had chosen her to take the moral high ground, so to speak, and then put everybody else in the house at risk.
Wait, it's so funny you say that, because I was listening to this on audiobook, as I said, and I thought, I know you, and we have a relationship outside of this interview, and I thought, oh, I'm really interested in what she's going to do with this. Surely she's going to pull back. Surely she's going to, nope, she's going there. And it becomes such an interesting dynamic within the family, within the community, and then within France as a whole. You had a lot of people talking about what did it look like to collaborate. And I think the women who had affairs for whatever reason with Nazi officers or Nazi soldiers, in a lot of cases are kind of painted with a broad brush about just being collaborators, and obviously they did something incredibly wrong, and it doesn't, right or wrong, however you see that, it doesn't get into the subtlety of some of the impossible decisions that people were placed into. And I think that especially having somebody in your home with access to you and also access to your children must have been an incredibly difficult situation. So I think, just writer to writer, I thought it was such an interesting decision, and a really brave decision to make too, because you never know how readers are going to react to that.
Well, and that, I think that was where, coming from romance, it really sort of went against the grain for
Yeah.
me to do that, because there was absolutely no romance involved. And to write that, and then there was that scene that I wrote where he basically wants her on his arm, and he's invited it's a big important scene for him, and he's invited other high-ranking German officials, Nazis,
Mm-hmm.
and Gestapo agents, and they have their mistresses with them at this point. And it's the German high elite within this in this area. And I have even my heroine who's in the middle of collaborating, wanting to judge the other women that are collaborating, and then realizing, well, I don't know why they made that decision. Surely some of them did because they're fair weather fans, if you will. She has a conversation with both her daughter and both daughters. She has the
Mm-hmm.
conversation about it, and both daughters have a different take on it. One daughter says, use it. The other daughter says, don't you dare. This is too dangerous for you. She's worried about her. And then she has the conversation with Josephine, the matriarch. And, it ended up being, it's not, the core of the story, but it did end up being a lot about the morality and the reality of what it was to have these people in their, to be occupied. It's war.
Yeah.
And women fought that war. They didn't pick up a gun. Well, some did, but in this story, none of them do. But each one of them fought that war.
One of the things that really struck me also was there's collaboration in a lot of different forms. So obviously there's the scenario we've talked about where you are the mistress of somebody, or you have somebody living in your home. So you're providing, cooking and cleaning and, doing laundry and things like that. But then I think there's a wider discussion in the book, and I wish I had highlighted the passage actually where it came up, but talking about how there's collaboration with some of the other owners of the champagne houses, but in some cases those are men, and maybe the collaboration is judged differently. You mentioned earlier that history is often written by men. Do you think that in this case in particular, maybe people were inclined to let some people off a little bit more because they were men, they were in different scenarios, and to be honest, it wasn't a sexual relationship or a sort of more intimate relationship if you had somebody living in your home?
Right. And I think the other Champagne Noir, the other basically Champagne house owners, they have a secret meeting to talk about what are we going to do about these guys that have come in, the wine bureaus that have
Mm-hmm.
moved in, that are stealing our wine and giving us these impossible quotas, and just the business of champagne making. And and Gabrielle's the only female there because she's representing her grandmother, is just not really in a mental place to be at this conversation. And they are all questioning that they stayed in the home because he came, and she's like, I'm not giving up my home to these people. Yeah. But the entire community now is talking about how because they didn't leave their home and they're making a stand, the women, that made them collaborators. And and yet there were other vintners and other champagne house owners that were staying in their home as well. So yes, you're right. And I think it was in that scene where her former father-in-law pulls her aside and says, be careful, there's whispers,
Yeah.
and be careful what side of history you end up on.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting approach to things. And it's interesting to see some of those discussions in print. Really quickly, I do want to make sure that we get back to some characters, but really quickly, we're getting some questions about the print copy. So we'll talk about this again at the end, but do you want to tell people where they can find both the ebook, the audiobook, and the print copies as well?
Okay, thank you. Yes, this one was kind of an interesting deal, was that Walmart, the buyers at Walmart really we're fascinated with this idea, the story, the trade paperback. It's a newer program for my publisher. And so they negotiated a print only deal with my publisher. So if you want to get the print book, you have to either go into your local Walmart or walmart.com. And super simple. You just go onto Walmart instead of going onto Amazon or Barnes and Noble. Just go to walmart.com, and then in the search engine, just do Renee Ryan books, and it pulls up all my books, but this one will come up. The audio is obviously available at audible.com, and then anywhere that audio is sold, and same with the ebook. Anywhere that the ebook is sold, you can get the electronic version as well.
Wonderful. So just because I know there's some questions in there, and please do keep asking your questions, because it's definitely something we want to make sure that we have time to get to.
And this is only for the launch, by the way. It will not be forever, the print exclusivity. That's only during the launch. Then we'll do a relaunch, and then it'll be available print-wise everywhere.
Wonderful, wonderful. So people can keep an eye out and find it, or they can go ahead and do ebook, audiobook, if they're not a Walmart shopper or don't have access. So wonderful. Right. Okay, so we've got that clear. Really, really want to talk about Paulette, who is not a POV character, but has a huge impact on this story. And it's always tricky with talking to authors, especially when characters really kind of come into parts of the story that are very spoilery, making sure that we don't spoil too much. But I think it's really hard to discuss this book without discussing at least a little bit about this character who has never known a war, and is very, very different from the three women that we follow through the rest of this book.
Well, the first choice that I made about Paulette was not to give her a point of view. Partly that was, I think, you did brilliant with 4 points of view, but I was just like 3.
Thank you.
I was like, I can't do more than 3.
It almost killed me.
A little selfish, but also she was younger. She was a teenager at the beginning of the book. She's, in her 20s by the time the end of the book, because the war breaks out in 1939. But she was the baby. I think I kind of touched on it earlier, where when the father came home after World War I and his lungs were damaged, his mind was pretty much damaged, it's sealed. I think I say something that one of Helene's lines in the book is that, the real war begins when the weapons are set down and these men come home, and you don't know what you're getting when they come home. They don't either. And so Paulette was the baby to save their marriage. This was the one he had changed so much. Helene had not changed at all. But when she realized that very young that he wasn't going to survive this war as the same man that he had been, and their marriage wasn't probably going to survive World War I, even though it's already, the weapons have been laid down, she puts all her energy into this child to the point of spoiling her beyond. Well, this child has become very entitled, very spoiled, it's Wednesday, we go to Paris so that we can have tea at the Ritz and go shopping at, Mademoiselle's, shop. And so she's been so spoiled. And in this book, there's 2 things that happen, is that Helene very quickly realizes how she spoiled this child to the point of this could end up ruining all of us. Because this child is not understanding. At one point, she's trying to kind of bang the truth into her daughter's head with, words. And the daughter says, "What is politics to me?" And they're in the middle of, they've got a Nazi living in their home. And because she's still being sort of coddled by, and it's like one of those things where it was also as a mother, thinking about kind of going through how I raised my daughter and wondering, did I do that? And
Interesting.
And I don't think so, because, but anyway, just sort of the responsibility we have as a parent when we're raising children, that no is not a bad word. And this was, and not spoiler alert, but it becomes a huge problem because this character, she has no filter, she has no off switch, she has not been taught really right or wrong. She's been taught, if it doesn't go right for me, I turn to mama, grandma, I turn to grandma, my grandmother, grandmère, and so she, grand-mère, I'm trying to get all the French words.
Yep, nope, you're doing very well.
I'm half French. And so anyway, so she just, everyone has always just coddled this kid, and it comes back in a really difficult way to haunt them all.
Yeah. It's really interesting because I think when I was reading it, I thought, gosh, she's such a spoiled brat. She really is. And then I kept reading it. I thought, she's really the worst. And then at the end of the book, I kind of thought, yeah, but nobody ever taught her anything different. And I'm actually, the wonderful thing about Facebook Live is that we get some live reactions. And one person said, Michelle says, she's sheltered. And I think that's exactly right. She's spoiled, but she's also sheltered. She's been kept from the world. Nobody's asked her to do anything or be anything other than, this kind of almost doll-like creature. And the one really, I thought, really interesting thing is she does actually have ambition. She has an ambition to be a fashion designer, and she has real talent and real interest, and her mother does, and rightly so, really cultivate that in her. It's just that she doesn't get all the rest of the exposure to the world in the way that Gabrielle, her eldest daughter, does. And they're very different people, but they were also born into very different circumstances. Gabrielle has a lot more memory of the scars of what war would have been like. She's had a lot more responsibility put on her. People have asked her for a lot more. So I think maybe I was a little unfair, actually, to Paulette through reading the book. And it's interesting kind of taking a step back and listening to you talk about what it's like as a parent thinking about writing a character like that.
She's very tragic, I think. And she's tragic because by time her mother and the rest of the women in the home realize, that she hasn't really been given the moral compass that the others assumed they had given her, because it's like, if I have one, surely she has one, but it's also something that was never really taught to her. And when she makes some pretty bad decisions, and then there's consequences, she's devastated over it, as are the other characters. The other characters are devastated for her. And yet there's also this sense of, but you can't be trusted anymore. And and digging into that sibling scenario, digging into the, the parent, grandparent, child of, I love you, but I can't trust you anymore because you've made some terrible decisions. And then not, and that was the hard thing about not having her point of view and not being able to sort of wrap it up. And I didn't want to wrap it up, as you and I had talked about, is that because that's how life really is. There are people that never really come to grips with a fallout in their own family. And I wanted to sort of show that both sides had their reasons, both sides had their remorse, but they just can't come together at the end and have the happily ever after as siblings and, things like that. Yeah.
It's so interesting. So what we were discussing before we popped on this call about how both of us like a little roughness around the edges at the end of a book set in World War II, because I think it's very, very difficult to wrap all threads up in an emotionally satisfying way, and have everybody happy and tell the entire story of everybody's life. and do all of those things in a book about war, because the reality is it devastates people's lives. And there are sort of moments of joy and good things that can come out of these scenarios, but there's also really difficult things and difficult relationships. And I thought it was a really, again, without giving too much away, I thought it was a really interesting way to not pull your punches again as an author, and to resist the urge to make everything neat.
Mm-hmm. And I would say that if I have gotten any negative response, which I haven't really, I've been very fortunate. Most of it's been pretty positive. I would say the two things that have come up is how, and I did this on purpose, is how these characters that are all in the same home and they're all navigating this occupation, and they're all trying to navigate this war. And there's not like sisterhood, girly,
Yeah.
sitting on the bed and bonding together, because they're all just trying to survive. And it's almost like being a stranger among your family. And so each one, it feels like she's alone in this fight. And part of that was not, it was intentional because of the choices each one makes to how they fight this war within their own home and within their own city, puts them in a place where they can't be intimate with their family members, or else they put them in danger.
Yeah.
And so I think that when people say that about this book, they're not seeing that other layer of why they're somewhat, there's a disconnect between the family relationships. And I think then the other thing is that I do tackle some really difficult issues, and I don't pull the punches. And so I think that like when the choices that Helene makes, and the choices that Paulette makes, and the choices that Gabrielle makes, and some of the dangerous things that Josephine does could have easily been watered down. And I decided not to do that. And it's not that there's a lack of remorse or a lack of immoral behavior. It's just there's a lack of pulling back when they know what they have to do.
Well, and I should say, it's interesting because there's a way to give your characters a full story arc and give them the full development and wrap that story up within the context of the war, and then know that they had lives beyond that. And I think that's what you do here. It is emotionally satisfying in that we get their story from the war, but they're only, I don't know, how old is Gabrielle at the end of the book? She might still be in her late 20s, early 30s.
Yeah, let's see, 28, 29, 30. She would have been 31 by the end of the war.
Sure. And I'm so sorry to put you on the spot about a timeline for a character, because I am terrible at that. But, it's interesting because, we do have characters that we want them to feel as though they live lives beyond the story that we're telling here. So I think that it's an interesting choice, and it's one that, I don't know, hopefully potentially opens us up to some future revisiting, but we'll have to see about that. So you never know.
That's right.
Exactly. I have a question from a reader, Kellyanne, who I think this might get a little bit into sort of the technical publishing side, but also answer a question around faith, which I thought was really interesting throughout the course of the book. So she says, I have a question about the title page of this book that describes it as an inspirational romance. I have to admit, I almost rethought reading the book because of this, but I reread the synopsis and decided to go for it. Good decision. So far in my reading and listening, this isn't a romance, which is a good thing for her, she says. So I'm wondering about the title page description. So I don't know if you want to kind of touch on imprint versus book, and then how sort of that all works together. But this might be an interesting one for people.
I'm so glad you asked that question. That, and I don't know, I'm going to say this super delicately, but it was somewhat of a battle on my end of requesting not to have that page in there and not to be represented as a romance. The deal is that this is a brand new trade paperback program. I mean, as you see, the book is not the light. Okay.
It never cooperates when you need it to.
A romance novel. It's not. Yeah, there you go. You can see it's not a romance novel. It wasn't meant to be a romance novel, but the imprint is within Harlequin. Is the owner of the imprint, which is owned by HarperCollins. And they wanted to try and do something that wasn't romance. The problem is that they are known for their romances, and that's all they've ever produced. This book is their first non-romance, and I think they've got 2 or 3 more coming, and they've got 2 more coming from me that aren't romance. And And when they did and this is a publishing thing, when they do the front matter and the back matter, which is the part that you're talking about, they tend to do, it's almost like, I think they just did what they've done for all their romance books and they didn't think it through. And some of their trade books are more romancy. So I think they didn't think, well, let's just redo it. And by time I was able to see the front matter and the back matter, it had already gone to print.
Sure.
If I had been able to catch it and they agreed, they would not have done that. They also have said that that was not, oops, you know, it was one of those
Sure.
things. And so this is what we're left with. So I could have, yeah. And the thing is that as soon, it was the first thing, I was immediately on the phone with my agent.
Well, it's so interesting. And I think that maybe this is where some of the behind the scenes of publishing gets a bit lost in the shuffle. There's always conversations about sort of what is a publishing house doing as a whole, and then what are the individual imprints doing as well. And certain imprints are known for producing certain types of books. So for instance, you know, there are all sorts of different imprints of Harlequin. So if they're trying something new, it may have to fit under the umbrella of something that they've done in the past, an imprint that already exists, unless they're launching something brand new. So it sounds like you literally were the very, very first one.
The very first one. And also even that inspirational romance, which means more of a Christian, I don't even know, like redemptive
Faith
arc.
works its way into the story. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
This story, I mean, and I don't think that it wasn't written to the Christian audience. It was written to, and again, now I do have Christian romances in the past, so I'm not going to, you know, completely say that I don't write those books.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is that this is not, it wasn't written for the audience, because if that's true, then a lot of the things that we were talking about, not pulling punches, I wouldn't have done. It was written to a broader audience. These characters, the faith elements that do come in here are more, they're true to the character because they lived in France during 1930s, 1940s. And especially Reims, which is a city of cathedrals. Catholicism is a huge, you know, the Christianity, their faith. And there's even a conversation at one point with Josephine and the Nazi living in her home. And they're talking about, it's right after the all the Jews were rounded up in Paris, and they're getting the news on the wireless. Mm-hmm. And she's just furious over this. And he's thinking, this is a good thing. We're getting rid of them finally. And she's like, you know, the Jewish history is our history. Mm-hmm. We, you know, their God is our God. And it becomes a really scary scene in terms of, because she's 79 at this point, maybe even 80 at this point. And, you know, she was raised in the church, and she's just not going to be able to pull back from that. So those numbers, so it wasn't by any means, it's part of the character and the time.
Well, and I it made me think as an author. So I don't know if people know this, but I'm not religious at all, and was never raised with any religion or you know, even just culturally in any religion. So for me, it was interesting because I think I actively have to remind myself, and I don't know that I always do a good job of it, of writing that accuracy for a lot of characters, because you know, decades ago that would have been a larger part of some people's lives. And especially if you're talking about a story, again, set in the place that you're setting it, absolutely, that would be an element that would be, people would at least be aware of, be thinking about. Now, people have differing degrees of faith, and I think you showed that within the characters in your book. But it is interesting having it, knowing that it's in the quote unquote inspirational line. I just think it's interesting to see how publishing moves and changes, and all of these things that get taken into account.
Yeah, and I think that would be probably, if there was a third negative for me from readers, would be that they wanted a much stronger faith element in that book. And for me, I felt like, but that's not, it was, for Josephine, it was who she was. And so the faith of it is in her personality. Gabrielle, she, you know, she has reasons, and you have to work during on the Sabbath. You know, there is no Sabbath.
Right.
And then you have Paulette and Helene that are Parisian, and it's not hardly, and Helene has a secret. Yeah. And to hide this, and that's the thing too, I wanted to touch on, and I'll touch more in my next book, is that anti-Semitism didn't start in 1939 when the war was declared.
Not at all.
And so her family intentionally raised her as a Catholic, going to the Catholic Church, um, because of her secret. And so you don't go into a church every single Sunday and not have some of that become who you are. And
Right.
so that's kind of how I wrote that character.
Yeah. We're getting some questions about what a trade paperback versus a mass market is. I don't know if I can do this without completely knocking everything over, but here we go. So this is a trade paperback. So this is kind of the sort of, I don't know, bigger than my hand size that you might see. And then I'm really sorry about this, guys. I'm climbing all over my own furniture here. This is a mass market. So this is what sometimes people associate with sort of traditional romances and other books. So you can see there's a big size difference. And in fact, this is a UK edition, so it might even be a little bit smaller than a regular trade paperback. But they're different types of books in terms of the printing approach. So these traditionally are cheap, and they tend to sell in large volume. And this is just a different format. So if you're curious about what we're talking about in terms of, different formats, mass market versus trade paperback, this is what's going on here. Did I get that right?
Yeah, you did. And traditionally, I also think your mass market is going to be more of your genre fiction, like your romances, for sure. Almost every romance comes out as a mass market. So if you're thinking, originally they're going to come out in the contemporary romance, historical romance, whatever it was.
Yep.
Those kind of books. A lot of your mysteries, cozies, they're going to come out mass market.
Yep.
And then now this is traditionally, that's kind of changing a little bit now because who knows, with the publishing, but your trade paperback were usually more of your mainstream stories. Why you see like a lot of the historical fiction, it's not necessarily a genre driven book that has a little bit more, and I hate to use this word because I know people twitch, has less of a formula to it. Every book has a different structure to it. That's you're going to find more in a trade paperback versus a genre is going to have more of a similar structure for each book that you pick up within that subgenre.
Well, and maybe this is a great chance to talk about genre fiction versus sort of mainstream commercial fiction with historical fiction. You've written a lot of books, a lot of books, and a lot of different types of books, a lot of different types of genres. And this is not your first historical fiction book. So can you talk a little bit about the experience of writing predominantly in romance and historical fiction and what some of the differences are for you in those two areas?
Okay, well, I think when I cut my teeth on romance, so I will always have, and I think that a really good, strong book is going to have a romance somewhere in it, because even I think about the movie Armageddon, where, they've got this big meteor coming to kill, to blow America up, and then you still have romance in there. Yeah. I think that you're going to, but when you actually pick up a romance, they are going to have a very, very tight structure. It's, two main characters meet. They have kind of what they call a meet cute. So it's going to have and it's got a very strong structure. You have to have that meet cute. They usually meet within the first 1 or 2 chapters, 3 chapters, depending on the length of the book.
Yep.
And the story is the romance. That's your main thread. It's the main plot. The longer the book, the more subplots you can have, and there's beats to it. You can almost, if you pick up a romance, you can almost tell by the middle, depending on the type of romance, it's either going to be a love scene, or it's going to be the first kiss, or it's going to be, and you can do that around the quarter point, the midpoint, the 3/4 point. There's going to be a dark moment, which means black moment, which means they're going to break up. And then they have a resolution, they come back together. So that's going to be a romance. And there's some real, when I first started writing romance, and I, like I said, I cut my teeth on it. I love that structure. And I always likened it to in New York City, when you go to like a school and they've got a fence around a playground for the kids are wild inside that playground because they've got the fence around them, and they can just
like that.
go where they want, and they've got the security. You take that fence down and they've done studies about this. They will get together in little clumps because there's not that boundary for them to feel that freedom. So when I first started writing romance, I looked at the structure of romance as my fence. And so I was able to tell a bunch of different stories within the same formula. But, right around 19 to 20-ish, 25 books, it started feeling a little like lather, rinse, repeat, lather, rinse, repeat. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to try something different. Historical fiction doesn't have that fence. You also, now every book requires research. I don't care this is, I don't care whether it's a short contemporary category book from Harlequin or it's a long sweeping romance novel,
Yep.
A Julia Quinn Bridgerton book. Um, Research is definitely required, but in a historical fiction, research is one of the characters. The
Yeah.
history is a character. But then you can have, like, I had 3 characters that were main. You had your 4 characters. Now you've done one with 2. We can mess around with timelines. We can sort of play around with characters. There's not necessarily a black moment the way that there is in a romance. You don't have somewhere where, okay, the hero and heroine or hero what is going to break up. And so I find that there's a lot more freedom in historical romance because, my master's degree is in a more researching oriented discipline. And I feel like I'm tapping into it, and it requires a lot more cerebral research and a lot more, I don't know, I'm rambling, but my point is
No,
that
I see what you mean.
is that when you're writing historical fiction, there's no rules. And without the rules, I get to make them up. That's freedom. And it's also, I feel like a little kid and I want to clump together by the slide and have a conversation with my buddy and not go anywhere.
Yeah, I can definitely understand that feeling. Certainly. I think one of the things also, so I had a similar experience, although you had a much longer publishing career before making the switch than I did. I loved romance. I absolutely loved it. I've always been a reader of it. I've always loved writing it. But there were some stories that I wanted to tell outside of the relationship between 2 people. And historical fiction, you do have different scenarios where you're looking at a family and familial relationships. I've written a lot about friendships and found families. There are different types and there's certainly romances. And I think, you and I have put those, both of us have put those into our historical fiction, but the emphasis is very different. It's, focusing on a character's journey and a coming of age, as opposed to the relationship between 2 people and the resolution of that relationship being a happy ending, or whatever it is. Your mileage may vary with whatever historical fiction that you're reading. But I think it's one of those things where romance gives you an incredible amount of discipline and really teaches you some fantastic character, plot, skills that I feel like I can see it when people say, oh, I wrote romance and then I wrote historical fiction. And I'm like, oh yeah, that makes total sense why your characters are really psychologically deep. And I know all their motivations.
Very true. And I think also, like I said, I cut my teeth on romance. In any genre fiction, I don't think romance would be the only one. It's just that's the one that I chose to cut my teeth on, is that, you really learn that it's about telling a story, not putting beautiful words on the page.
Yeah.
That if the reader gets lost in your language and the words in a genre fiction book, you have failed. And so I think that because they're not reading, you want them to think that they are watching a movie in their head when they're reading that. And it's a skill that has to be learned. It's not a natural skill. And I could go into technical show, don't tell, word choices, things like that. But, that was the thing that romance taught me, was every single word you choose matters. And it creates a subtext. And, and I learned subtext and I learned motifs and I learned things when I wrote my longer romances. And especially when I was writing for my Amazon publisher, where they gave me a little more freedom. And so I can say that, but I am a better writer. I came into historical fiction knowing how to write. And I don't think I could say that without having the romance background.
Yeah, I'm always glad to hear that. I'm always glad to have that come up in a conversation, because I think it really is, it's important. And I think readers read across a lot of different genres and appreciate a lot of different types of books. So it's an interesting one. I would love to ask you briefly, because I'm sure we could go on forever, about the research behind this book. We've had a couple questions about whether you were able to go to France for it. And then also, my question would kind of go hand in hand with that a little bit, is how much French do you have? And did you feel like that helped or hurt, the research process for this?
Well, okay, so I was not able to go to France, which was
a shame.
Total shame. We had it planned and then COVID hit. And this is a book that has been playing in the back of my mind for a long time. I had done, I think it was 2012. This is how long ago when I first kind of got a little bit of a thought about it. I had to go back and check before we came on today. I had written 2 romantic thrillers set in World War II. And so I had already sort of done tons of research about, Hitler and how much he had stolen from all the different countries. And I found out that, champagne and wine was France's. And so I really wanted to set something around that. And I didn't know whether I was going to do it in the wine, like Bordeaux, or whether I was going to put it in champagne. But that was sort of where that came from. And so then over the years, while I was fulfilling contracts, I was doing my research, and I was getting books and, and source materials, and really digging into the research of it without starting the story yet. I just wanted to know about what was happening during that time, and continued to research World War II, even though I was writing a Western, or I was writing a contemporary or a Gilded Age era. So it was like my hobby almost that I was doing it. So I can't say that I actually had very organized research, but I would just, whenever something that would hit me, I would make notes. And I have like this, I think my notebook is this thick of all the different that I took of all the research that I did. Maybe it's actually 3 notebooks at this point. So that's kind of how it all sort of, the research happened for me. By the time I was ready to tell the story, I had done all the research. And so now it was me trying to fit in the story, the characters through that. So that's kind of how it happened. And I knew I wanted to set it on a vineyard. And, I knew that was going to be part of it. And you asked, what was the other part of the question?
It was about how much French do you have, and sort of was that an issue with researching this book? If you were not fluent,
it was a little bit. But my on my mother's side, I'm 100% French. My mother's 100% French, but they are. They came. She's New Orleans, Louisiana French. She's Creole, not Cajun. They didn't come through Canada. They came straight from France. So there's a lot of connection there.
Okay.
And they speak French, but French in my grandparents' home and with my mother they spoke it and didn't teach the children, so they could have conversations without us knowing what they were talking about.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And so I was not given the language and so I have, translators are amazing.
Yeah.
And so that has been super helpful. And then also I would listen to French speaking people, and I would listen to, like I would watch, I think, what is it? There's something about my agent. There's actually
Call My Agent. Yeah, it's on my list of things to watch.
Yes. And I watched that. So I just kind of tried to, anything that had Paris or France in it. So I just tried to immerse myself in the culture as opposed to researching it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a really interesting approach. And I imagine gives it kind of a different feeling than necessarily just strictly sitting down and saying, okay, I need to look up this fact because I want this to happen.
Yeah. Oh, and then of course, tried a lot of champagne.
It's the hardest part of the job. What can I say?
It was the absolute. And my poor husband, he helped, he was forced.
Very big of him.
Well, I'm a connoisseur of champagne. I'm actually kind of a champagne snob now. I'm so
well,
bad.
I think you should be. Absolutely. Absolutely. And eventually, if you can get yourself to champagne, you'll have to go to some of the champagne houses.
Oh, we're going next. We're going as soon as we're waiting for this Delta variant to calm down, but we're planning for 2022.
Excellent.
A little late,
that's good to hear. That's all right. Well, it can be a reward.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to ask you about what's next for you, and if you can share a little bit about that.
Yeah, I can. Well, it's contracted, the book, and so I'll share a little bit of it. It's set in it's 2 heroines. One is a British Londoner. It starts 2 timelines: 1933. That will chronologically meet up to 1943. So, and then 1943. And the other heroine is from Salzburg, Salzburg, Austria, and she's an opera singer. And she ultimately becomes, she marries a conductor, and she ultimately becomes Hitler's favorite opera singer. And she uses that as her weapon. I love giving these women these tools that become weapons for them during the war. And so she becomes that. And her contact is the British girl who she ultimately becomes an artist, and her art is transformed when she hears Elsa, who's the heroine, sing.
Interesting.
Her art prior to this was very derivative, and her art, and so they become sort of these compatriots through the arts,
Mhm.
and her art begins to get on the radar, and then Elsa's art sort of informs hers, and Hattie's informs Elsa's, and they become friends. And what happens is Elsa has a Jewish grandparent that or great aunt that she needs to get out of the country in 1933, because like we had talked about, anti-Semitism did not
Yeah.
start. And at the time there was they were allowed to leave. The Jewish people were allowed to leave Germany and Austria and these other Germanic countries, but they could not leave they left with the clothes on their back. And
Right.
then had to be sponsored in England or America. And they had to prove that they could either take care of themselves for 2 years, they had to have a job, or they had to be sponsored by a family,
Mhm.
and in order to get the visa, in order to leave. And so what's going to happen is my two heroines are going to work together to rescue Jews out before the war, and then they'll continue once the war starts, but it becomes harder because now they're enemies, because you've got the Austrian and you've got the British.
Mhm.
And
That refugee effort before the war is so interesting. It's something I've never really seen anybody tackle before. So I'm really curious about
well,
this.
the
And I
book
think,
is,
yeah,
and the horrors that they, and there was still it was very scary. They could have easily been arrested for treason, even though there was no war or anything like that, because there were laws. And so then I'll go through when the Nuremberg laws were passed, and the annexation of Austria. Like it's a real interesting timeline, and how much harder it was. And they had the labor camps long before 1939, and how they were able to. And then my heroine will ultimately, one of them will be arrested and sent to a camp. And there was a camp that they would take these high value prisoners, and then they would trade them for high value German prisoners.
right.
So I'm going to be dealing with that too.
That's going to be absolutely fascinating. Really, I'm excited for this one. So
I'm
wonderful.
excited. I'm excited. It'll be it's a hard one. It's a hard one, because that's why I think you saw I did I did a storyboard, because it's so complicated in terms of
Yeah.
timeline, and so I had to do a storyboard.
Yeah, I lean on those pretty heavily myself. So I completely understand the storyboard. I saw the picture and I thought, yep, makes sense to me. So
The colors and the color
yeah,
coding.
absolutely. I liked the blue sticky notes for gaping plot holes that you weren't sure what you were going to put there. And I thought, yeah, that sounds very familiar.
I was like, I don't know how I'm going to figure that out, but it has to be figured out.
Exactly. Well, before we wrap up, I'd love to get some book recommendations from you. If there's anything that you've been reading, enjoying, and wanting to tell people about recently.
So glad you asked. Okay, so this one I think let's see, how far am I? I'm pretty, this one, The 3 Hours in Paris.
Oh, I don't know that one.
Oh my goodness, it is so good. It's this Cara Black, I think she has a whole mystery series. So this is much more of a mystery historical fiction. But it's about the 3 hours that Hitler was in Paris, and they're not sure. And it's, the heroine is a sniper, and she is tasked with assassinating Hitler.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's the 3 hours of, it opens with the attempt, and then the failed attempt, obviously.
Right.
And then it shows the Gestapo agent trying to find her, and then her running from him. And it is fascinating. I'm so excited.
That sounds really interesting.
I can hardly put it down. And I'm just like, it's such a, again, a different take on World War II, because there's so many World War II books, and I just loved, and it shows her, it goes back and forth, dual timelines, and about how her training, and how and why she becomes a sniper, why she doesn't have anything to lose, why she's the one chosen. It's just very well done. And then I'm also, and I think this is just, again, it's like I'm tired of my romance. This one is Dead to Her. And,
I mean, that's a great title.
Isn't it? Dead to Her. And it's two heroines, and it's set in Savannah. And I have roots in Savannah, Georgia. And it's set in Savannah, and it's about these two heroines, and they're both sort of what I would call they're the second wife of these older men, the second wives. And the new one is from London, and it's how she has come in and sort of knocked off Marcy. The other one is in her early 30s now, so she's kind of getting a little long in the tooth. And then the other one is in her 20s, and it's just the adversary, and then there's a murder mystery in it and all that. So I think I'm just like really gravitating toward mysteries.
I do that too sometimes, especially when I'm deep in plotting something. I just need something different.
Yeah. And I think that, I always have, I say I throw it in, it's not thrown in, but usually a mystery and a little bit of a romance thread in my books. And, and so I would say this one, and then anything by Ruth Ware. I mean, I just think she's amazing.
Yeah, she's fantastic. There are a couple of hers behind me right now. So
it's her voice. I mean, she also tells a really great
she does.
mystery, but it's her voice. I mean, she's, I think you and I have talked about it. She's very voicey, and I'm kind of getting into, because in romance, you can have a voice, but there's still parameters to it. And I love in historical fiction, you can really run with your voice. You can really have a voicey.
Makes it interesting. Well, this has been absolutely fantastic. I want to make sure that you get a chance to tell people not only where they can find you online, but also where they can find the book, The Widows of Champagne, as well.
Okay, so again, easiest to find me is on Facebook, Renee Ryan Books. I have two, because the Renee Ryan got to 5,000. And then I needed to get to the Renee Ryan Books, which is more of a business page, but not everyone wants to go over. So I just both of them. So you can find me on either one. I actually am more active on Renee Ryan, the personal page. And then Instagram, Renee Ryan Books, Twitter, Renee Ryan Books, and then www.reneeryan.com, my website. So that's the easiest way to find me. You can Facebook message me. You can join my newsletter, or you can just send me a contact, however you want. And that's about the easiest way to get in touch with me. As far as where to find the Widows of Champagne is any of your online stores. You can get the ebook and then the audiobook at Amazon or audible.com. And then the print book right now for the next month and a half. So 2 more months or another month, you can get it at walmart.com, just the print. Well, you can get it all, but if you only want the print, walmart.com, or if you're not a Walmart shopper, you don't like to go into your Walmart. But the one thing that I've discovered is Walmart is a huge book retailer. And they're wanting to become sort of the go-to. They're actually going right after Amazon. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the next couple of years. So this is one of those deals that they've done that they're thinking more of, we're going to go out straight after, the other retailers.
Yeah. So for the next 6 weeks or so, walmart.com, and then it opens up to a wider.
And then you'll be able to get it anywhere. And if you forget, just tag me and I'll let you know.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation. I always love getting a chance to chat with you.
I know, I love you.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you guys for watching. We'll be back next week, and have a good week. Happy reading.